Oh, good morning, everybody. My name is Martin Rauchbauer. I'm the Austrian tech ambassador in Silicon Valley. And on behalf of Open Austria, EIT Digital, and the EU delegation to the United States in Washington, D.C., we would like to welcome you to our webinar today, which has the title EU+US, the Transatlantic Tech Agenda. You're welcome to chime in through the Q&A function of Zoom, as well as through the chat function, and we will try to include your question in the course of our discussion. We have some really very interesting guests from both sides of the Atlantic with us. But before we jump into the discussion, I will really happy to welcome Willem Jonker, who is the CEO of EIT Digital, our partner here in organizing this event, to say some opening words.
Martin, thank you very much for organizing this together with us. My name is Willem Jonker. I'm the CEO of EIT Digital. Together with Open Austria, we are organizing this event. And I would say it's extremely timely if you see what's going on at the moment. Of course, there has been, especially also at the European side, quite some attention for regulation of the digital world. It started with GDPR, more recently DMA, DSA. Just today, the new cybersecurity center was opened, addressing all kinds of themes that have to do with platforms, with tech, and the role of tech in the landscape. Also, the more recent developments between the, I would say, new US administration and the Commission have opened a new chapter on topics like taxation, also of digital services, but also about cross-Atlantic collaboration. And I think some important and good steps have been made. There are enormous challenges ahead of us. Of course, ethical AI is another topic that finds at least in Europe, efforts for regulation, and there is agreement across the Atlantic that joint efforts are needed to make sure that citizens benefit in a proper way from all the advantages that digital technology brings. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion of the experts that we have around the table. And once again, also thanks to the colleagues from Open Austria for organizing this together. Thank you very much.
So much, Willem, for sharing those opening remarks. And now we're going to move into our conversation. So to begin this discussion today, we're going to start with an initial round of questions to each of our individual speakers, and then we'll transition to a more open discussion where we will also field questions from the audience. So make sure to put your questions in the Q&A function in the chat. To begin with, we're going to start with Alejandro Cainzos. He is a member of the Cabinet to Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager at the EU Commission, and he advises her on the international aspects of her portfolio, cybersecurity, and defense. He has previously advised the Commission's Deputy and Acting Secretary General and held other positions in the Secretariat General and the Directorate General for Internal and Market Services. So our next speaker, Peter Fatelnig. So Peter Fatelnig is Minister Counsellor for Digital Economy Policy at the Delegation of the European Union to the United States in Washington, D.C. Peter's long experience in the digital tech sector, notably in building industrial innovation strategies, helped the EU to drive toward internet innovation policies. As a senior manager at the European Commission since 1998, he is committed to a positive European vision of future internet society and economy. So Peter, we were going to get a little bit of an overview of the Trade and Technology Council, but I'd like to ask you a little bit more of the nitty-gritty details on this new initiative. So how will the TTC work in practice? I know there's lots of talk about working groups, so who will be in them and how transparent will the TTC be for the outside world to watch?
Thank you, Kylee, for having me. And that's of course the big question we are all kind of trying to figure out at this stage. Now, when Alejandro comes back and gives us a bit of the overview, indeed, one of the outcomes of the EU-US summit is this creation of a Trade and Tech Council, which in fact has been proposed by the European Union And you find it back in the communication on the EU-US agenda of 2nd of December 2020 already. Now, with this sort of initiatives, and as usual, it needs two to tango. So we have been working closely with our US counterparts also to make a proposal and interact with them in the run-up to the summit, so that we have now something on the table which is thoroughly shared by both sides of the Atlantic. So what you read in the summit statement of the Trade and Tech Council is really the outcome of an intensive conversation among us. So this also, I'm saying that because I want to transmit the commitment here to this Trade and Tech Council. The nitty-gritty of it is maybe that, in fact, I think maybe we could have been a bit less ambitious in the beginning. That's my personal view. We could have said, well, maybe 5 working groups, let's go for the top issues. But we have also seen from our US colleagues a tremendous appetite to launch more conversations, to go into more of the important topics. So you see now that there are 10 working groups which have been proposed, and they range from they range over a variety of topics, from standardization to data governance to platform conversation. I don't think anybody going through them would be sort of shocked. I think they just tackle all the issues which we have seen so far in the transatlantic relationship as major points of conversation. Now we transform them into a working group, both sides of the Atlantic committed to it, and we are approaching that with a collaborative approach to find together solutions, find together ways to deal with these issues.
That sounds excellent. And I guess my little follow-up is, will these working groups be transparent to the outside world, or are they going to be more kind of internal discussions?
Very, very important point. Now, the participation to the working groups will not necessarily be open to anybody. I think this is something where we would also like to keep, maybe even on purpose, the group relatively small to have frank conversations. We may even launch very small setups to allow both parties to present their ideas in a safe atmosphere without necessarily committing to this. So exploring the landscape is certainly part of this conversation. Now, they are open in the sense of, at least from the side of the European Union, I think we need tremendous help from the stakeholders. I mean, we are acting here essentially on behalf of the stakeholders. That's civil society, that could be industry, that could be other actors. There's a role for the European member states. So there we are setting up the processes of gathering that input and making sure we are also a representative, or we have a representative conversation for those stakeholders. And that's a two-way street. You cannot just go out and ask people all the time, tell me, tell me, tell me. There will also be a feedback way. And so that may not be exactly the same conversation, but they will be part of the picture, which I'm so excited about because that's a really big machinery. We're looking at it right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is very important to have stakeholders represented in these conversations. So I think that's a great addition.
I agree.
And now I see that Alejandro has been able to join us with video. And so now we will go back a few steps and get, the general context of the EU-US summit. And so what was the atmosphere of this event? And from the EU's perspective, was it a full success, or did Europe hope for more?
Thanks a lot for bearing with me there. Glad it's working now. I think the atmosphere reflected the moment we are in our relationship with the new administration coming in, and I think it was very positive, and I think it confirmed the intention that we had on our side when we put out back in December a communication outlining some ideas and initiatives to relaunch the relationship. Not to rebuild what used to be, because both the EU and US have changed a lot in the last 4 years, but rather to build something new, something more balanced, more stable, and where the EU takes a bigger role as a partner to the US. And I think digital fits quite well in there. And that was the reason we proposed back in December to launch this Trade and Technology Council, a proposal that we repeated in March when we set out our own goals for Europe's digitization by 2030, because we see the Transatlantic Partnership as a core part of our own goals. How we interact with each other will obviously have an effect on whether or not we manage to achieve our ambitions on both sides. So in that respect, I think it was successful. The launch of the TTC and a number of other things, even some concrete initiatives around research of genomic data sharing, for example. I think it was quite remarkable what we managed to agree, bearing in mind the administration had only been in place for about 3 months. Really, no, 5 months in general, but I think we only got our counterparts able to prepare this only a few months before, and of course it's just the start of a process. It was really an agenda-setting type of summit. We launched not just the TTC, a number of other dialogues as well, which is normal at this stage because we have. I think 2024 is the year where both mandates end, both of the European Commission and of the current administration. So we know what's the timeline ahead of us to get things done.
That's excellent. And do you feel like all the initiatives were a success during this summit, at least from the European perspective?
Well, I think it would be difficult to imagine a better outcome, as I said, with such a short preparation time frame and knowing some of the legacy and difficulties behind on some of these issues. One can always wish for more here and there, but I think we need to be very satisfied, but certainly not relaxed, because actually the work only starts now. And as I think Peter was saying, because I only caught the tail end of it, we have a lot of work ahead of us to make this a real thing, and we need to have very concrete short-term deliverables in the TTC while keeping a long-term strategic mind, and I think that's our intention.
Yeah, and that sounds wonderful. And thank you so much to both Peter and Alejandro for giving us the European perspective. And now I'll turn it over to Martin Rauchbauer to get the American perspective.
Thank you so much, Kylee, and thank you, Peter and Alejandro. I would like now to introduce Fran Burwell, who's a fellow at the Atlantic Council and a senior director at McLarty Associates. From 2008 to 2016, Dr. Burwell served as the Atlantic Council's Vice President for European Union and Special Initiatives and Director of Transatlantic Programs and Studies. She previously led the program on transatlantic relations. Her work focuses on the EU and its relationship with the US, as well as a range of transatlantic economic, political, and defense issues. She's a member of the advisory board of Allied for Startups. Fran, I would like to refer a little bit to a comment that Alejandro made about his assessment of the summit, when he said it kind of reflected the moment we are in. And I was wondering if you could also comment a little bit about this moment we are in. The Biden administration has been now 3 months in has been now in office for half a year, almost. And how important is technology and regulation of technology for the Biden administration domestically? And why is it, in what way and how much is it interested in international collaboration? So what does the TTC and the agreement on forming this council mean from a US perspective?
So let me just say first, thank you for including me in this. Let me start by saying that the Biden administration made clear from actually before it was inaugurated that repairing relations with Europe would be one of their top foreign policy goals, and specifically highlighting the relationship with the European Union, and as they put it, increasing the level of ambition with the European Union was going to be one of their main themes coming forward. And I think certainly the summit demonstrated that. There were actually 10 groups, including the TTC, that were set up. We don't know how well any of them are going to work, but certainly the summit declaration was one of the most substantive that we've seen in many, many years, if not the most substantive. But it was a list of good intentions. And I think that there's no doubt that both sides want to fulfill those. But I do think there are some issues in the way and that they will have to struggle with. And I would say the TTC is an important element in constructing a conversation that needs to be had about tech. And one of the things that the summit did, along with, in combination with the G7 summit, which was held a few days before, was really elevate the role of tech and digital policies among these, shall we say, like-minded countries, the US, Europe, and the other G7 members. And I think that whereas in the past, tech has been an afterthought at the highest levels of government, I think now we will see tech addressed even at the very top levels. The TTC will face some real challenges. Number one, although I say tech is going to be discussed at the top levels, it's often difficult to take a technical subject and to make it something that leaders want to grasp and understand. So there's always this constant push, which the TTC will experience between putting it in an expert working group, and that's why they have the working groups, so that people who understand the issues can deal with it, and having the political leadership that is required to actually make an agreement. And although it's not being handled in the TTC, one of the first issues that we will see that we need to address is that of data transfers and the after effects of the European Court of Justice decision to invalidate the Privacy Shield mechanism for data transfers between the EU and the United States. We don't have a resolution on that. That's the kind of thing, it would be nice if the TTC, while not figuring that issue out, creates pressure to move towards an agreement. I think the other big issue about the TTC is that the stakeholder participation is not clear. I'm glad to hear, I think it was Peter, say that they anticipate that that will be a major element. But the history of these dialogues between the United States and the EU is that the two governments don't really push for business engagement, other stakeholder engagement, as well as parliamentarian. And there's a growing conversation between the European Parliament and the US Congress on tech issues. So a good move forward at the summit, at an excellent summit, I would say. The TTC is a good move forward, but there's a lot of uncertainty about how it will actually work and what it will actually be able to accomplish.
Let me follow up a little bit, because you already mentioned some of the challenges, like the data transfer, and which is really a direct EU-US topic anyway, so it needs to be addressed by the EU and the US. But let's talk about, all these other technology issues, which the US is also dealing with domestically. Why is it, if you look at the current moment in the US, why is technology so important? We know, of course, we all remember the transition period, and we remember what happened on January 6th and the role that social media companies played in that. But how much does the American public want these very sensitive domestic issues, which are also very polarizing, about content moderation, how to regulate big technology platforms? How much does it want to add, in addition to the already very complicated and polarizing domestic situation, add an international element to it?
Well, I think this is a big question, and I don't think that there is a clear picture of how the US people want our government to deal with tech. It's clear that the Biden administration has come in with more concerns than the previous administration, certainly, and so even more than the Obama administration, about the role of tech and particularly social media in terms of our politics. And it's clear from the bills that have been put forward over the last few days, and there was a letter today from the Republicans, that in Congress, this has become a very partisan issue. What that sometimes means is that people will put out bills, messaging bills, if you will. They'll put them out to stake out their claim of where they want to be, but the bill may or may not go forward. My hope is that we will see consideration of a privacy bill, because I think a comprehensive US privacy bill, because I think the big issue we are seeing in California and elsewhere, an upsurge of public support for a privacy bill for concerns about people's private data. And it's much better to have one bill rather than 50 separate bills. That would be much worse than having the EU have 27 different rather than GDPR. So I hope that we will see that. It is not clear to me that the administration has figured out yet exactly how it wants to organize itself in order to do international engagement on tech issues. The EU is remarkable, particularly the Commission, in the way that it is organized to deal with its two big priorities, digitalization and green sustainability issues. But we're not organized that way. And it's going to take a lot of pushing and pulling to get commerce, state, US trade representative, as well as others like the FTC and the FCC to pull together, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, for example, on cyber, to pull together in a comprehensive way. And so we're going to have to see how that works out in what is still a very new administration.
Thank you so much. And I would like to now pull in Eileen Donahoe. Eileen is the Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University here in Silicon Valley, and also the Cyber Policy Center. She served in the Obama administration as the first US ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva at a time of significant institutional reform and innovation. After leaving government, she joined Human Rights Watch as Director of Global Affairs, where she represented the organization Worldwide on Human Rights Foreign Policy, with special emphasis on digital rights, cybersecurity, and internet governance. And of course, we work very, very closely with Eileen in the framework of the Freedom Online Coalition here in Silicon Valley, really trying to unite like-minded countries around this issue of digital human rights. And Eileen, my question really is about this issue of like-minded countries uniting, whether it is the EU and the US or whether it is through the G7. I was wondering if we look at the geopolitical dimension of this new Trade and Technology Council, is this actually going to strengthen the like-minded countries in order to get an international framework that is based on those same values, based on human rights, based on the values of liberal democracies? And I do think that you sometimes also look at these things in terms of not paying enough attention to the geopolitical context of technology.
So, wow, so many different strands there. First, thank you for including me. Yes, the geopolitical dynamics are the heart of this issue for me. I will say that sometimes when we look at the tech agenda, there is a sprawling range of issues that are covered. And just in the last 6 months, obviously last months, competition policy, platform accountability, platform liability, harmful content, cybersecurity, AI, and human rights. And now we're finally getting really focused more on the strategic tech issues, whether it's strategic tech investment or more looking toward the geopolitical dynamics of tech governance. And I am very pleased to see that. When it comes to the TCC, maybe one of my concerns is inadequate sense of urgency. And to your question about like-mindedness, there is a really interesting tension here, because we do need to heal the rift, the transatlantic rift, over everything, and tech policy in particular. And I have to, as an American, I have to say, Donald Trump in the White House was the single most deleterious factor in our relationship in every regard. And it is understandable that the rift has grown. And there are already differences, but significant factor. And to your Alejandro's comment and your earlier question to Fran about the moment, I do think we all need to recognize, and I hope the Europeans recognize, the Biden administration is a really important juncture, and we all must seize the opportunity and really get back on the same page and come together. It's urgent. The reason, there are so many dimensions of this. First, let me say, we can't just focus on the like-minded in the medium and long game. Short term, we need to get together and ally ourselves and heal the rift. And Privacy Shield alternative is probably step number one. And as Fran just said, in the US, we need federal privacy regulation. But it cannot stop with just a new transatlantic alliance. We need to rebuild a global, democratically oriented alliance, and we must be the majority. We must get back there. We must be thinking of human rights values as universally applicable, never adhered to completely anywhere, but we have to hold on to the concept that there are inherent rights in citizens, and they apply everywhere, and we have to protect that normative pillar of the post-World War II order. Here's one point: the Biden administration, as was said earlier, I guess by Fran, clearly wants to, heal with Europe on every dimension, and they've also put promotion of democracy or strengthening democracy and human rights at the center of foreign policy. What we really need to do is join those normative commitments with the tech agenda much more explicitly. We need to elevate the normative dimensions of tech policy as a strategic priority. And this gets to the interesting thing, which is the rift between the United States and Europe is, some of it's, a lot of it's competition, okay? And a desire to build an innovative tech environment in Europe. But some of it really is around disagreements over our shared values and what they should look like in digitized society. And that is ultimately the European Court of Justice last summer striking down Privacy Shield. It was on fundamental rights grounds. And so I would hope, and Peter, you were talking about the 10 working groups. I hope the first one, which I have not heard about, is about figuring out how to harmonize our understanding of how to protect fundamental rights, human rights, because we both agree that those should be prioritized and protected around the world. But we need to find a way where the US government's interplay with its private sector platforms is not perceived as a threat to fundamental rights of European citizens. And that's where we are, and that's where that broke down. And so last point, let me say, I think that rather than seeing the tech agenda as a series of discrete challenges that need to be solved, we need to understand this as a paradigm shift, and a digitization of society has radically altered the context for democratic human rights-based governance. And all of us, US, Europe, and all of our democratic allies need to adapt to it. And we have not. We are slow. We are behind the curve. But who's ahead? China's ahead. Russia's ahead. Authoritarians have done a marvelous job for themselves in capitalizing on digitization of society. And they are spreading a digital authoritarian model around the world. And that is by role modeling repressive uses of tech. It's by exporting repressive applications, exporting entire information infrastructure through which they are gaining leverage over weaker democracies and swing states. And they are flooding the zone of international diplomacy and cyber norms diplomacy. And we are on our back foot in those realms. And we have to get our democratic tech policy houses in order and figure out how to do it in a way that's consistent with human rights. And we don't need to be homogenous, but we need to be harmonized, where we don't have a rift in the democratic world. Then we need to win. And this gets to Martin's top question. It's not just like-minded. We must win back the majority in the international normative realm and diplomacy realm. And part of that is we have to win on the strategic tech investment and development front. And this is what the authoritarians know. If you win on technology, if they win on AI and quantum computing, it's like game over. So we cannot afford to only focus on the normative agenda or the competition agenda at home. We have to focus on the R&D agenda and make sure we win there. So I will stop.
But I do want to ask you a follow-up question on that aspect. This, you know, it's not just about the EU and the US, it's about the majority, and there's a struggle, kind of a global struggle between different value systems, and the right one needs to prevail. So I know that you're also involved in the preparations of the famous, one of the famous initiatives of the Biden administration, the Summit for Democracy. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because we know that technology is an important aspect of this summit. Is that kind of the initiative to rally the majority? And what can, you know, this new TTC, what role can this new TTC play in the preparations of the summit that we think will be probably the beginning of next year, if I'm not mistaken?
Okay, so to say I'm involved in planning is not accurate. To say I am actively involved in advocacy in terms of what the tech agenda should be is
the right thing.
Absolutely
okay.
Correct. And I will say what I have been I feel like, because the challenge is, as I said, not a series of discrete tech issues, and it is really about having the democratic world develop a shared vision of democratic, values-based, human rights-based governance that is compelling and attracts the majority of governments around the world to its vision, because it will also mean greater economic development, greater security. So it's got to be the full package, but helping people see that we are now in a normative battle and a technology battle and an economic battle. They're all tied together. And I am advocating for recognizing that it is our normative perspective of openness, democracy, respect for human rights, protection of human rights, that is part of how we will win the geopolitical battle and the technology battle. So the three buckets that I have tried to sort of separate it into is, one is get your democratic tech policy at home in order, get your house in order. And this is for each government. And in the US, it's, privacy regulation. And I would say human rights impact assessments with respect to government use and regulation of technology. And oh, by the way, I will say some of the regulation coming out of Europe from an American human rights advocate's point of view is not always consistent with human rights principles. So this is where we need to figure out, we have to move each other. And that's why I hope one of the first working groups for the TTC is on this. We've got to move each other in the right direction of harmony on that. The second one is reinvesting in the Freedom Online Coalition and in our active advocacy for democratic norms and human rights. I mean, just this past week at the Human Rights Council, last week, we're already in the new week, there were, competing declarations on China's use of technology in Xinjiang. And China was able to rally more countries to support its perspective than Canada was with our allies, our so-called like-minded. That's a disaster. And that is a radical change from a decade ago when we passed that first resolution at the Human Rights Council on internet freedom, which was by consensus. And that's because the authoritarians could count and they knew the majority were with the good guys. That's how the world has changed. And then the third bucket again is about the strategic technology investment. And we have to band together in that strategic technology focus. This is what China understands. They have had massive investment in technology, and they know their power in all of these realms: economic, military, geopolitical, diplomatic, all stem from their technological power. And so we can't take our eye off that piece of the equation.
And I'm sure that the EU-US relationship will be crucial in this geopolitical debate. And when you say majority, you really literally mean majority, because of course in multilateral institutions and the UN, and when it's about norms and resolutions, it's the majority that then sets these new standards. On to you, Kylee.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. So now we're going to open up into our discussion. So I'll invite Peter back up. Great. And so for this section, we are going to ask a general question. And if anyone wants to speak up and answer it, we can have a couple people raise their hands and then go from there. So for our first question, let's talk a little bit more about the challenges. I know a couple of these have been mentioned, like the privacy shield, or harmonizing our views on human rights and how to protect those. So with these challenges where the EU and US don't see eye to eye, what will it take to find a solution? And whoever would like to start, please raise your hand and we'll pass it on to you. Eileen?
Maybe,
Fran, please go.
Fran.
Go, I just finished.
So, well, I would say that there are a significant number of differences. Along with Privacy Shield, right now we have a putative deal on digital services taxes. We also have some issues with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. For those who are not following it really closely, I would say that there's a huge amount of legislation, very ambitious legislation, coming down the pike in Europe. And the timing is just off because the administration is not really ready to start engaging. They've done some, but they're still, a lot of people are not yet even in their offices in the new Biden administration. So, but I think that what it comes down to actually is talking about the specifics. I think that both parties are very much on the wavelength of what Eileen is talking about. I think they're very aware that it's a competitive world economy out there. And if we don't work together, other powers are sitting there ready to eat our lunch, so to speak. So I think there is the right focus on innovation, but also working together. But let's not pretend it's going to be easy to reconcile competing regulatory frameworks. And the US is in a situation, the last few years, the US has been in a situation where it has really been very laissez-faire about the tech community. It has thought, the general assumption has been that existing rules were sufficient for the digital economy. Europe, for some time now, has not thought that and has looked instead to regulate and to figure out how to make the digital economy something a bit different from what the United States has been talking about. I think we need to talk about that. We need that discussion. We need to, the US is shifting, but it's not clear where it's shifting to, or who is shifting. Is there enough shift in the United States that it's actually going to make a difference, or is it just one of those things that kind of comes up and then disappears again? So I would say we really need to focus on specifics. And the good thing about the TTC is that if it works as laid out in the summit declaration, that's just like a paragraph. It will focus us on some positive issues. And I think it's always good to start with the positive issues, such as supply chains and things of this issue, technology development, research and funding. But we have to move quickly to resolving the issues that divide us and the differences that divide us. Especially, we don't want to be in a situation where the EU in 2 years has a whole new set of regulations that American companies don't understand, find difficult to deal with in a major market without having had a full conversation about that and figured out what are the implications.
Of course, thank you so much for that perspective. And now, Eileen, would you mind if we asked Alejandro to give the European perspective?
As you wish. Okay, then I'll come in now. I think I very much like the three buckets that Eileen described, because that's also how we think about it. And I think there are challenges and opportunities on all three of them. If you think about the bucket of how to make sure that democracies set the rules of the road when it comes to the digital economy and society going forward and what that means globally, I think a lot can be achieved together, especially if you frame it in the way that Eileen did. This is really about promoting things that are universal. I get tired of, talking or listening about privacy as if it was some kind of European invention with the GDPR. I mean, privacy is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that every single country that's a member of the UN has signed up to. So when we cooperate, and the good news, Eileen, is that we will have a working group on the misuse of technology against human rights. So when we cooperate on how we promote this values-based vision around the world, most of our partners are not interested in being pawns in some geopolitical game. What they want from us is really attractive packages, attractive propositions which help them solve the real problems they have and help them bridge the digital divide that we are seeing growing around the world. And we want to do it in a way that empowers them to protect what is a universal value, privacy, but also others, to empower them to protect the data of their people, and empower them to protect their own security. So in a way, it is about digital sovereignty in that respect too. So I think in that frame, there's a lot that can be achieved. On the second bucket, it's more the one that Fran was talking about. Admittedly, there have been obviously tensions around regulation, but it's also a question of intellectual coherence, that if you want to promote open markets and human rights and and fundamental rights around the world, you need to do it at home as well. So in that respect, that is the spirit behind all of these legislative proposals. And I optimistic that there is convergence in the assessment also now on both sides of the Atlantic. And Fran mentioned there are bills on almost all these issues in Congress as well. Some of them, I would say, even more ambitious than our legislative proposals. And indeed, it is the right moment to have this conversation. So I think the timing is right, and we are moving on from you're regulating US companies starting point to this is the issue we have in our democratic economies and societies as regards digitization. What are the solutions? How do they look like? And the third bucket, the innovation and investment bucket, is extremely important. I agree. But there we also need to learn from the difficulties of the past 4 years and think very hard about how we can build interdependent, mutually dependent and resilient supply chains among both sides that we can rely on also in times of crisis. And the vaccine experience has been difficult in that respect, and that we can rely on also if the political situation changes again. And we've seen interdependencies weaponized before. So I think it is extremely important that we think hard about that as we move forward with this unprecedented public support that both sides are going to now grant to digitization. Apologies for being a bit long.
No, it's completely fine. Thank you so much. And I appreciate how you broke it down into those 3 buckets. And now I'll pass it on to Eileen.
Just a couple quick reactions. I want to respond to Fran's point about we can't kid ourselves about the difficulties and the different approaches to regulation. And there I need to say, we still have incredible political dysfunction in our Congress. And so I like to look at the executive branch as the place where the adults are and where there's more opportunity. So I'll just say that. And then to Alejandro's point, I really agree. But I think that both sides have to move toward finding agreement in the normative realm. In the EU, I think it's important that, yes, we've got mega platforms, but the United States is not China. And equating the United States with China is terrible for everyone. It's just, that we need to get past that. On the US side, you're absolutely right. We cannot think that the Europeans created the right to privacy through GDPR. There is so much ignorance when it comes to the importance of privacy in the United States. And, you know, it's not, it didn't just arise with mega platforms. Privacy is essential to the exercise of liberty, all kinds. Free expression, freedom of assembly, association do not exist if you don't have privacy. And similarly, digital security for individuals is also a human right. So we need to get much more sophisticated in the United States about the centrality of privacy to the whole package of human rights. Oh, and the point about digital divide, you know, all of us who focus on civil political rights, I think there's been a wake-up call. There was a recent poll that said inequality is becoming the biggest threat to democracy around the world. And lack of digital connectivity, the connectivity gap, the digital divide is the heart of that problem. And so we need to, all of these governments need to focus at home on that connectivity gap and then, you know, abroad. And I guess it was the G7 communique on the joint investment plan, where they really linked this idea of helping with connectivity infrastructure in the global South as, in fact, a strategic issue and competition with China's Belt and Road and Digital Silk Road. So we need to keep that connectivity thing on the table, even if we care about liberty.
Yes, of course.
I do want to mention that there's a a comment in the chat function, responding directly to Eileen, saying, granted, the US is not China, but Twitter and Facebook carried the Chinese propaganda on Xinjiang and on of course, the Uyghur situation there. But I think Eileen would be the first to recognize that we need to take care of these international aspects of digital authoritarianism back here in Silicon Valley. I would like to ask a question to all of you that shifts a little bit gears from the geopolitical situation and asks, since we are in Silicon Valley, asks about what this new EU-US collaboration on tech means for businesses. And I'm not just talking about the big digital platforms, but also the small and medium-sized enterprise, the backbones of both the EU and the US economy as well as for the startups. And my question here is, if regulation has, of course, in some ways, different aspects and different effects and sometimes unintended consequences. One of the good things of international collaboration, what we often hear from businesses, is that it kind of removes this patchwork of different regulations, which is always good for small companies, that they don't have to deal with many different, often contradictory regulation frameworks, but that in some way international collaboration unifies that. That's good for business. But on the other hand, the EU has, of course, a very different economic situation when it comes to its innovation ecosystem compared to the US, and particularly compared to Silicon Valley. So my question to all of you, what does it mean from the perspective of businesses that the EU and the US have now vowed to work together closely on technology? Maybe Peter first.
Yeah, maybe I just give sort of a couple of pointers as they come to mind on that. That's a very big question, and one could probably debate for weeks and months on how this could be going. I think one element or one line of answer is that, are we certain that we live in times of maximum innovation? Because I don't think so. I don't think that we have to take for granted what we see or have seen the last 10 years. That's the pinnacle of innovation. Therefore, we should not change it or tinker with it. We have seen the best already. There's nothing more which can come. No, I don't think that's necessarily a truth. I cannot support it with facts, because the facts will be in the future. But I think we should not fall into this trap of, oh, we have seen the best and not more can come. So I think there's an imperative for the public sector to enable that future we don't know. And I'm not necessarily, second line of thinking, and then I would like to stop and also have others chipping in on that one. Second line of thinking is that there is, and with all respect, I think many of our friends, and I think you, Martin, too, kind of see innovation or the economic power of the United States linked to 4 or 5 companies. That would be a big mistake here in the US, to link the success of this country to a company like Amazon. That would be a big mistake in my view. So I think the well-being of Amazon is of no concern to the United States of the future. And I think this independence hasn't really happened. And I think we have a lot more in Europe, not because we are more clever, but just because we don't have Amazon in Europe. So there's a more, we just think in dozens of Amazons. We have hundreds of Amazons, which perhaps together are quite big as well, but that's irrelevant. So I think this diversity and thinking about, that's good. That's a situation we want to have, because that's competition, that is innovation, that is a more nimble environment than a one-stop big shop. That I think is something which should be part of that answer too. And I would like others sort of to chip in and maybe add or whatever views you have.
So Peter is asking not just about, what does it mean for businesses, but what does it mean for small and medium-sized businesses versus to these big Amazons, the digital platforms, and of course referring to one issue which you might also talk about competition, because that's really what's behind Amazon, or rather this debate about, what you do about monopoly power by these big digital platforms. And since they are not just domestic monopolies, if they are monopolies, but global ones, that calls probably for collaboration as well. So any comments on that dichotomy, the big platforms versus the small and medium-sized enterprise? And again, the question, what does it actually mean for the companies, big and small? Francis?
I think the simple answer is that we don't know yet. We are likely to see a great deal more US-EU conversations at the highest level on these issues. And given that the EU is already moving in one direction and that the US is trying to figure out where it's going, I think the EU, in a sense, brings more weight to this conversation, even if there are specific things that I would very much disagree with in the EU's legislation that is moving forward. I think there are other issues, though, for small companies especially, and the one I would point to is not, Europe is often accused of not being as innovative. I agree with Peter. We don't know yet what is going to happen in terms of future innovation. And the EU is doing a very interesting experiment right now, which is essentially looking at technology that it considers trustworthy and ethical as almost like a brand. And in that paradigm, what can you see in terms of innovation? I think this is fascinating to see whether it's different from what we've seen in the past or where it ends up going. But one of the key things that Europe will struggle with, at least under current rules, is scaling up. There are lots of European startups. Like startups all over the world, they live and want to be bought up by some of the bigger companies, not necessarily the big five, but they do, so a lot of startups do, that's what they want. So I think we also have to take that into account. But I think that in Europe, what we've seen is startups getting to a certain point, and then both because there's not yet really a digital single market within Europe, and also because of the financing issues, coming to Silicon Valley to look for additional financing or getting bought by American companies. So I think that this current conversation opens up the opportunity to talk about these, but I think this is why it is really important that the TTC or some element of this conversation happen with business in the room, not just big business, but a spectrum of business on both sides of the Atlantic. I think that's really going to be important for us to figure out how we can collaborate and where we can. Having said that, I will say that I don't think for 1 minute that we're going to end up with the same regulations on both sides of the Atlantic. We will both continue to regulate in the way that works for us, each of us, but we can hope that they are a little bit more compatible and that we also understand more what the other one is doing and why they're doing it. And I think that would be useful.
Go ahead. Thank you, Franz. And go ahead, Alejandro.
Thanks. Maybe 4 quick points in reaction to what Peter and Franz said. First, I obviously agreed with what Peter said about differentiating success of a company with success of a country. And in that respect, I think we always have to bear in mind that we're not going to outcompete China by being more Chinese ourselves. None of the big tech became big through some government design plan. So we need to play to our own strengths, which are open, competitive economies. And in that respect, obviously, that's the starting point for our conversation when it comes to regulation. How do we set up the framework for the next big tech to arise? How do we set up the framework for innovation to flourish in a way that we keep that edge, which I think it's a shared objective. So I think indeed we might not end up with the same regulation. I would never expect that, but I hope that this understanding of what we want to achieve, a shared assessment of the challenges, will take us into a much more convergent ground. That also goes with what Fran said about values-based innovation. And that's very much the way we see it. And I think there is a lot of potential for very active policies coordinated on both sides in that respect. It goes also for helping SMEs access digital tools and scale up, where we have a lot to learn from the US. So we do have actually a specific working group on that under the TTC, which I hope will be successful. And final point that has not been mentioned yet, but it's absolutely crucial for transatlantic economy and for our competitiveness at large, is standards. And here I expect we'll put a lot of emphasis on trying to work together on setting the standards of the emerging technologies, not getting stuck on trying to reimagine standards already set, but really about what's to come in the future, because obviously common transatlantic standards would be a huge boost for industry on both sides.
You want to react to that, Eileen?
Sure. I just want to join. It's absolutely not the end of innovation. Strangely enough, I think there's more alignment on some of these challenges related to big versus small in a transatlantic context than is appreciated. There are 5 bills in the US Congress right now, and they're bipartisan, on competition. And it gets at the heart, I could name them, but I won't. Whether anybody in the Congress can pass anything, that's another question. But at least there's genuine bipartisan. And unlike the disinformation challenge, where they see it from completely different vantage points, the competition challenge, I think there's growing alignment in the Congress with Europe. And it's on this point about big versus small and wanting to keep an environment for new innovation, the potential for future. There's something strange about network effects that happen with big platforms that actually had the opposite of what was originally thought of. It entrenched the big ones. Here, I will say the Digital Services Act seems kind of complex to me, and it's got a variety of things going on. But I think those concentric circles about there's an important insight there about the social media platforms, marketplace folks, cloud, and then ISPs, and the different function they play. And we've got to get our heads around how we think about competition and innovation in those realms differently. Amazon is in the second realm. They've skated from attention, whereas everything's been on social media. So I think that's one thing. And then the original vision of the global open internet was to distribute power and decentralize power. And I think there's growing awareness that even in the tech community, that the next generation of innovation is going to be around that. And I think the whole crypto thing has an energy around redistributing and decentralizing power.
Thank you so much, Eileen, for those comments. And now I'd like to turn our attention to the chat. So there have been a couple questions so far. One was actually already somewhat addressed by Eileen, which was the likelihood of passing those bills. I believe she was the attendee was referring to the US bills. But maybe we can move on to the next question about taxation of the big digital behemoths. Do any of you have any thoughts on those? I know that was mentioned pretty prevalently in the G7 meeting. So the taxation of big tech.
Well, do you want me to have a first pass on that? I mean, it's not the favorite subject, and frankly speaking, it's also not necessarily the most important subject. I'm saying that because if you look back at the proposal the European Commission has made for the digital tax, or taxing a change of the taxation to be fairer to the economic situation we have, which I think is a more accurate way of saying it. Back in 2018, the revenues of this tax would have been very, very small. So we are not necessarily talking about opening a revenue stream for the public purse. It's perhaps more a question about fairness, contribution. And the economy has changed, the way companies are functioning has changed, the globalization has changed, the way our value chains are distributed over the world, and taxation has not kept up with that. So that's essentially the basic narrative. Now, how do you change that? So and I think that's exactly, again, what we thought. There are two ways. You know, you have to have the longer-term conversation, and this is something we are seeking in the OECD with like-minded countries, a reform, a small and steady reform of bringing taxation in line with reality. And the other one is taking maybe more quick actions to address the issue we have at hand right now. And ideally, you would do both. And I think that's a bit the desire we see here. So I think the more important thing is, how do we evolve the taxation or tax rules to the reality we see today in the world? How these companies operating, where they are domiciled, where they collect their IP, how they transfer value within companies. So these are all the real issues. And as long as we don't understand them, well, we do understand them well, as long as we don't address them well, we will always have that conversation about taxing big companies. But don't forget, it's not necessarily about adding huge revenue streams to that. If I remember correctly, the 2018 proposal of the European Union would have added 5 billion euro to the public coffers. That's across Europe, not exactly a great amount, but I think it would have added to the fairness of how we deal with this sort of situation. I'm sure others have additional view on that, and please chip in.
Thank you for that perspective, Peter. I think the fairness angle versus, fundraising is a good way to look at it. I'd like to turn it over to Fran.
So I largely agree with Peter. I mean, there's clearly a need to rebalance who pays what tax where. And in fact, the OECD process is called the base erosion process because it's about the tax base having been eroded by the emergence of an online economy. And we've gone through this in the United States when Amazon first started. It didn't pay sales tax in any state except like one. And meanwhile, there were department stores and malls, et cetera, who were suffering a decline in revenue because of that. And it had to be readjusted. I do think that Peter's point about it's not such a huge shift in revenues when you get out the accountant's pencil and figure it out, is a very interesting one, because I think that this, right now, the issue is we have an agreement at the G7. We're hoping in July it will advance through the G20, and then there'll be an OECD agreement. The US, this administration has finally engaged in this process. I think we were really heading into a bad place previously, but we're now engaged. They've made the interesting proposal that the companies to be taxed will not specifically be digital, but they'll be the 100 largest companies. That'll be massaged and shifted perhaps. I think we do need to look ahead to the day when all companies get income from their digital activities, rather than saying this is a digital company and this is not a digital company. So we need to have that in mind. My concern is that a number of European countries have already passed a digital services tax. The US has made clear that when the OECD process is complete, that these taxes will be removed. The European Commission is putting forward a digital tax proposal for the EU, which is also trying to figure out how to raise its own revenues as an institution. But it's so hard for any government to give up a tax once it has a tax on the books. We all know that. It's just really tough. So I'm hoping, this is one of those instances where I think we are now moving ahead together. And I'm hoping that the issues of the past will not derail that, because I think if we end up with an OECD-based tax system that everyone is starting to implement, but there still remain digital services taxes independent of that, which I hope will not be the case, then it will be a little bit of rough seas ahead.
Yes, I would like to also ask another question from the chat, a section about digital sovereignty, which is of course now part, not only in the EU, but other countries are also betting on that. And the question really is, what about strategic autonomy, open strategic autonomy, level playing field, digital sovereignty, etc., that seems to be still debated within the EU. How is it understood by the US? And I want to add something. How is it understood by the rest of the world? We hear here in Silicon Valley by some technology companies that digital sovereignty in Europe may be one thing, maybe even a good thing, but then what about if every country claims, that the data has to be within its borders, and if they are, does that not lead to a fragmentation, for example, of the online space? Does it also maybe lead to does it make life easier for digital authoritarian states? That's sometimes what we hear in terms of criticism of that concept. But going back to the EU-US relationship, what will happen to the EU's insistence on digital sovereignty in this new transatlantic collaboration? I've seen Eileen nodding, so I'll let her start.
I think the economic dimensions of it are complicated, and I might leave that to Fran and others. I can comment on the geopolitical and the implications for the global internet. On the geopolitical front, I think the danger is that the concept of digital sovereignty is a little too close to the Chinese concept of cyber sovereignty. And the distinctions between them are not well understood, even though I do believe in Europe, the intention is different. But the meaning in the Chinese context is a very long-standing authoritarian perspective, which is what happens within our borders is our business, and you have no external basis for critique, including on human rights grounds. And so it's kind of antithetical. It's a cyber version, updated version of a longstanding position that's antithetical to the concept of universal rights as a basis for critique across borders. So that's the first thing. Second, the animating energy on some level is really understandable in Europe, that it's a desire to protect the rights and interests of citizens. And there are many factors that are making European governing actors feel like they're not doing it, and that maybe this is the right move. Everything we've been talking about, though, about the need to band together, find harmony, have shared strategic tech investments, et cetera, and harmonize policy is kind of in the other direction. And the important point is to think about what is the meaning and value of a global, open, interoperable internet, and how does it relate to democracy and liberty, freedom for people. The implications of cyber sovereignty, not only in the data localization sense, where the trend line means that authoritarian governments actually have access to data of foreign, like Apple has had to housed China data of Chinese consumers in China and hand over encryption keys in order to be able to stay in that market. So think about the consequences of that. And they were willing to fight the FBI, but they didn't have the leverage to fight the CCP. So the implications for privacy of data localization are good, but all this idea of sovereignty is being used on transborder content as well. And it is questioning whether we will have the free flow, not only of data, but information, free expression, access to information. And I ultimately think in digitized society, protecting the open internet, a global open internet, is what will reinforce the potential for democracy. And I think that if we shut it down, we are moving more in authoritarian. We're playing into their hand.
Thank you so much, Eileen. And I see that there was a comment that popped up in the chat that I think was slightly related to this. And they ask, isn't sovereignty the definition and essence of any country? Would you like to quickly respond to that?
Yes, it is. And I would say that, this is something Thomas Ilves always talks about, the post-Westphalian, we're in this post-Westphalian moment with the global open internet, which has been really challenging to the traditional concept of sovereignty. But there's also a book by Richard Haas where he has this evolution of this idea of sovereignty now has to evolve as a concept where you are responsible for what happens in your borders. Even pre-internet, human rights provided a basis for critique of sovereignty. And the UN Charter, there's a tension between sovereignty and human rights that has been there since the beginning. We're now looking at responsibility for transborder effects of what you do. I think that response to all of the security vulnerabilities that stem from information, transport information operations, transborder reach, can't be that we shut down the globe and that we all retreat back to our nation states. I just don't think that's feasible, and I don't think it's the right move. I think that's what this is about. And so we do need to evolve our sense of sovereignty, and I do think it has to be based on human rights values and understanding of the benefits of being able to connect and share globally.
Thank you so much.
With rules.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for elaborating on that question. And now I guess I'll pass it over to Alejandro with his hand raised.
Yes, I think I can agree with everything Eileen said. I mean, the good news of the Trade and Technology Council is that hopefully we will move beyond academic debates about concepts into actual measures and policies and what these means. And that will, I'm sure, dispel any doubts about false equivalence when it comes to some of the concepts mentioned. And it will, I think, also demonstrate that there is no contradiction between the wish to protect an open, decentralized internet where freedoms can be exercised, with the need to ensure that the rights and obligations that citizens have in the offline world are also present online. And this is a key part of sovereignty, because the alternative we have seen is that if our democracies are not able to ensure that, then the key decisions that will shape our digital economies and societies will be taken in a handful of corporate boardrooms. And this is, I think, something that all democracies need to think about. And I think we should be able to find the policies and measures that reflect that balance, and I'm certain that it is possible. This will be necessary for the EU. It will be also necessary for the US to show that it's ready to boost its innovation, its competitiveness, while maintaining an open economy, especially towards its partners. And I think there will be a number of decisions to come when we think about the big plans, either just passed or being passed in Congress. That it would be an important signal for partners on how the US sees our economic relationship also on the technology front.
So I would like to now, since we have only 8 minutes left, ask a question to everybody. Maybe everybody can give his or her own definition on looking into the future of this EU-US collaboration. And I'm asking you kind of for measures of success. If we look at the end of the current mandate of the Commission, or at the end of the mandate of the current Biden administration, what would this new TTC have to have achieved in order for this initiative to have been successful? Do you think it's going to become a permanent feature of EU-US transatlantic collaboration, independent from the current administrations? And I will maybe start with Peter.
And I take it in the reverse order. I think if something becomes a permanent feature, I think it becomes less attractive. So it's gonna be the hot thing for the next 2 years, or whatever time frame you want to put on it, and then we need to be able to evolve it. Also, I think we will have learned, and we want to evolve it. It's kind of either becoming bigger, more nimble, smaller, changes direction. I think that is needed, and that, to my taste, should include the change of name and these sort of things. So if you stay permanent, you sort of fall behind in this conversation. Now, measures of success, I think, frankly speaking, at the end of the day, they could be many and they could be simple. You can count the number of press releases. You can see the number of specific actions we have agreed in that across the 10 working groups. Within each and every one, there will be small agreements we are finding. The question will be, and I think that the real measure of success will be the tuning down of certain language and commenting. I think the building up of trust. I'm not sure how you measure trust, but I think both the US and Europe will move along their own trajectory. Nevertheless, if we trust each other, it will build that trusted transatlantic partnership. And there I would be keen to hear then as well, what is that measure of trust? For me, it would be, and I think quoting here President Biden, if we can make it boring again, the transatlantic relationship, I think that may be a success.
All right, who's next? I'm asking Fran, looking into the future.
Well, I'm going to disagree with Peter. I don't want transatlantic relations to become boring again. And we think tankers don't get a chance to talk about it so much. But, and I will also disagree that I think we should be looking at the TTC as a permanent feature. I actually am a bit concerned about the melding of trade and technology. I think they did a good job in the statement of showing the connections between them, but I don't necessarily want this council to get hung up on Airbus Boeing in 5 years or the steel and aluminum tariffs and those type of questions. I certainly spent enough of my time in the past talking about bananas and other things like that, these trade disputes that go on and forever. And I'd rather this looked forward. I think that, but I do think in order to look forward, there needs to be a commitment that this is a long-term thing. Maybe it's just a thing of semantics, but we need to have those. There are, I think, 2 co-chairs on the EU side and 3 co-chairs on the US side. And it's going to be hard to keep those people engaged. So we have to figure that out. I would hope that we will see real communication on standards and movement together by the US and the EU in standards bodies, that we will have a very serious supply chains discussions we are both in the wake of COVID looking at how our supply chains can be resilient. And I think also what I would love to see is more US-EU coordination on cybersecurity standards, Internet of Things standards. How do we make our tech infrastructure more resilient? The US right now is having a tendency to talk about China all the time. I agree with the danger, but in Europe, they'd rather just talk about how they're going to do it and not point to one particular country. And I think we need to be cognizant of that. I thought that the summit declaration was very useful that way and a good illustration of that. In terms of specific accomplishments, I would love to see something that was in the EU proposal for a joint shared agenda along with the TTC, and that's an AI accord, artificial intelligence. How are we going to use it together? The EU has put regulations, proposed regulation on the table. Is that something that could be the basis of the way we work together? Because AI has, of course, tremendous potential to be abused by governments. And I think it's one of the technologies that is kind of at the front line of the democracy versus techno-authoritarians that Eileen has been talking about so much today. And I also think, though, that we have to get some of the hard things solved, data transfers, and we have to resolve this conundrum about national security versus privacy on the internet for our citizens, for citizens living in democracies. What is necessary? And I hope that the US and the EU can come together on that, and that the TTC will be the way that we have that discussion.
Thank you, Fran. I would suggest first Eileen and then Alejandro. This is final statement.
So I
go ahead, Eileen.
So much of what's just been said. I put a sense of urgency at, that's a big, everybody should have a sense of urgency. These things aren't even starting till September, right? So, or something like that. Maybe they're planning in advance, but the three areas, the first of which is this issue of initiating a process for harmonizing our normative approach to technology use and regulation. And so it's not just human rights impact assessments of use of data by the private sector or even use of data by governments. It's also the human rights impact of regulation. And we've got to be thinking about, in this geopolitical context, what are the implications for open democratic societies of taking this approach? It may have short-term benefits of protection, but long-term, it will undercut the viability of our entire model of governance. And so we have to be forward-leaning. I do agree that the privacy national security debate we need to make progress on, and certainly domestic privacy in the US. Second bucket is what we have to band together and win the technology battle on current critical supply chains. On future technology, AI and quantum are the two that I feel like, what I understand is whoever wins in those realms, it's like it owns the universe. Everything will be dependent on those things, or all forms of security will be undercut and we'll have to start over. So we cannot lose that battle. And I do think we have to invest in the connectivity issue for everyone and really understand how important that is. And then the third one is win the global diplomacy and norm debate and standards debate, which is what Fran just said. It's not just the human rights norms, it is standard setting for future interoperability standards. It is, she said, IoT. These are the things that will either play back into the success on the technology front or have us lose. And if we don't get back in the game, we'll lose on all fronts.
Will it become permanent, TTC?
I would say I don't know if TTC needs to be permanent. I care about urgency. I was disappointed when I read about it at first. It's like, good idea, but bring that sense of this, we really need to get this going now, ASAP, and, you know, put the energy into it on the front end. And hopefully we will get ourselves more quickly to a better place. And, you know, maybe it won't need to be permanent.
Alejandro.
Well, I can agree with pretty much everything that has been said, so I can be short. First of all, to reassure Eileen about the sense of urgency, we share it. We're already working hard. My family can testify to my long evenings, and including this one. And we are very determined to make it a success. And I think part of it will be to combine, as has been said, this really concrete short-term deliverables, which are there to be grabbed. Some of them might be boring and technical, but crucially important. Some of them, and we will need quite a few of them, that are very visible and that have a strong signaling value to our societies and also globally, that democracies can get their act together and work together. And I think AI could be one of those realms, but a few others as well. And there will be more difficult issues to work through. So I think the underpinning motive of success on all of those things, as Peter said, is trust. I like that. I think that is the first thing that we need to achieve to restore trust in areas where it has been eroded in the past and where we need to build for the future. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. And do you think the TTC will stay?
Oh, I don't know. As I said, we both have mandates ending pretty much the same year, with a difference of a few months. So we have a certain time frame in the horizon for when we will be judged, those working on it at the time. Whether or not it will be permanent beyond that, I couldn't tell. What I know is that success begets success. So the more we achieve, the more likely it will continue.
Of course. And thank you so much to all four of our panelists. I think you all shared very insightful and unique perspectives that really helped us all better understand the future of the transatlantic tech agenda and relationship overall. So thank you to the four of you for spending this much time with us. Thank you to our attendees. And on behalf of Open Austria, EIT Digital, and the EU delegation to the US, thank you so much for coming today. Have a great rest of your evening, morning, or afternoon.